You've reached Frontiers of Antiquity, a podcast exploring the places where civilizations collided, ideas traveled, and history changed forever. Thank you for listening.
Picture this. It's the 1st century BC, and you are standing in the very center of Rome.
Right, in the Forum.
Exactly. The beating heart of the most powerful, rigid political machine on the planet. And suddenly you hear the sound of shattering marble.
Which is definitely not something you expect to hear on a normal Tuesday in Rome.
Right. You turn around and you see Roman soldiers on the direct orders of the Senate taking literal sledgehammers to a religious altar right there in the city.
Just completely destroying it in broad daylight.
Yeah. And the crime of the people worshiping there, they were just being too emotional. I mean, they were crying, they were chanting, they were experiencing this religious ecstasy. And to the conservative Roman establishment, that wasn't just weird. It was dangerous. It was an actual threat to the state.
It's so wild to think about because, we often think of ancient religions as these incredibly rigid, top-down compliance mechanisms.
Yeah, totally. Cold statues, priests reading from dusty scrolls, citizens just doing their civic duty.
Exactly, because for a long time, the dominant historical narrative viewed ancient religion almost entirely through the lens of civic obligation. It was a transaction.
A transaction, right. Like paying a tax.
Pretty much. You make the sacrifice so the state doesn't fail, so the crops don't die. It was essentially a legal contract with the divine.
Right. But today, we're going to completely upend that notion for you. Because today's deep dive is into a religion that started as a local myth and went utterly, undeniably viral.
Viral in a way that is almost hard to comprehend for the ancient world.
Totally. We are talking about a movement that crossed borders, entirely erased class lines, and offered something so totally radical for the ancient world that it, like we just said, terrified the political establishment.
They were offering the promise of personal salvation.
Yes. Today, we are exploring the cult of Isis.
It really remains one of the most fascinating cultural phenomena in human history, largely because of how it adapted.
It's the survivor.
It is. It survived and thrived across millennia by constantly reinventing itself, all while retaining this core emotional appeal.
And we are looking at a massive stack of sources for this deep dive today. We've got historical texts, incredibly detailed archaeological timelines, and even a highly revealing, completely wild ancient novel.
Yes, the novel is fantastic. We'll definitely get to that.
Oh, we have to. Our mission today is to explore the rituals, the history, the expansion, and the really explosive adoption of this cult in antiquity. Okay, let's unpack this. How on earth did an ancient Egyptian mother goddess become a religious superpower?
It's the million-dollar question.
Right. How did she captivate everyone, from the most marginalized enslaved individuals to the most powerful Roman emperors? I feel like to even begin answering that, we have to go way, way back.
We do. To really understand this massive phenomenon, to grasp the sheer scale of her influence across the Mediterranean, we have to travel back thousands of years before the Roman Empire was even a concept.
Wow. Okay, how far back are we talking?
We have to go back to the sands of Old Kingdom Egypt, roughly around 2500 BC. That is where we find the original blueprint of the goddess. And it's a blueprint that is incredibly specific in its power dynamics.
2500 BC.
Right.
So we are talking about the era of the pyramids. We are talking about a time when woolly mammoths were still walking around on some isolated islands.
Precisely. The timeline is just vast. Her first textual appearances are actually carved into the walls of tombs.
The pyramid texts, right?
Yes, what we call the Egyptian pyramid texts. And right from the beginning, in those texts, Isis is not some minor background deity. She is absolutely central to the most foundational, deeply resonant myth of ancient Egypt.
Which is the Osiris myth.
Exactly, the Osiris myth.
Okay, for those of us who might be a little rusty on our Egyptian mythology or who maybe only know the broad strokes from pop culture, let's walk through this. Because looking at the sources, this isn't just a story about a god creating a mountain or throwing lightning. It's a profoundly human, deeply tragic story.
It really is.
This is the story where her husband, Osiris, is murdered.
Right. Well, it is much darker and more visceral than a simple murder. The myth, in its oldest forms, tells us that Osiris was a benevolent king of Egypt, bringing civilization and agriculture to the people.
A classic good king figure.
Right. But he was killed by his jealous brother, Set. And Set didn't just assassinate him, he tricked Osiris into a beautifully crafted chest, sealed it shut with molten lead, and just threw it into the Nile.
Which is already a horrifying concept. It's like asphyxiation and drowning combined.
And it actually gets worse.
Of course it does.
When Isis eventually finds the chest, she hides it in the marshes. But Set discovers it while hunting by moonlight, and in a rage, he tears Osiris's body into 14 pieces.
Wow.
Yeah, and he scatters them across the entire length of Egypt.
Just to make sure he's gone for good.
Exactly, ensuring that Osiris can never be whole and therefore can never pass into the afterlife. Because to the ancient Egyptians, physical preservation of the body was the absolute prerequisite for eternal life. Set is essentially trying to delete Osiris from existence.
He's trying to erase his soul, basically. And what makes Isis so fascinating in this original narrative is her reaction. She doesn't just sit in a palace and mourn him.
No, not at all.
She doesn't wait for, like, a male hero to go fix the problem. She becomes the active protagonist of the story.
She is entirely the driving force. She searches the entire country, traveling up and down the Nile, finding every single piece of her murdered husband.
Which must have taken forever.
It was a monumental task. She reassembles him, creating the very first mummy, and then she uses her immense magical capability to briefly resurrect him.
And she resurrects him just long enough to conceive their son, Horus.
Yes. And that single act of defiance against death establishes her core attributes.
The things people actually worshipped her for.
Exactly. It's the absolute bedrock of why people prayed to her for the next 3,000 years. First and foremost, she is the master of Heka.
Let's drill down into that word, Heka, because when we say magic today, modern listeners think of sleight of hand or maybe Harry Potter.
Right, someone waving a wand.
Yeah, we think of it as something supernatural that breaks the rules of reality. But the sources explain it differently. How did a follower of Isis actually understand Heka?
That is a crucial distinction. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, Heka wasn't a violation of the natural order. It was the natural order.
Oh, interesting.
It was the fundamental underlying energy of the universe. Think of it almost like the source code of reality. The gods used Heka to actually create the world.
So if Heka is the universe's source code, Isis is like the ultimate master programmer.
That's a brilliant way to conceptualize it. She knows the true names of things, which allows her to manipulate that underlying energy.
Because you have to know the name to rewrite the code.
Precisely. Because she wields it so effectively that she literally conquers death and reverses entropy to save Osiris, she becomes the ultimate protector.
Which makes total sense.
Yeah.
If you are sick, if you are dying, if you are afraid of the dark, you don't pray to a god of war.
No, a war god can't help you with a fever.
Right. You pray to the goddess who can literally rewrite the code of reality to keep you safe.
Exactly.
You've got this profound cosmic magic, and then you pair it with fierce protective motherhood. Because after Osiris officially passes into the underworld to become the judge of the dead, Isis is left alone.
She's incredibly vulnerable at this point in the myth.
Yeah, she's pregnant. She's hiding in the papyrus swamps of the Nile Delta, trying to protect her infant son Horus from Set, who wants to murder the baby too.
Which introduces an incredibly relatable element to her mythology. She experiences fear, she experiences poverty while hiding, she acts as a single mother desperately trying to keep her child alive against insurmountable odds.
She's not just some untouchable deity on a cloud.
No, this makes her deeply accessible to the average person. She represents motherhood, healing, and eventually, because Horus grows up to defeat Set and reclaim the throne, she represents universal sovereignty.
She's the kingmaker.
Yes, she is the one who ensures the cycle of life, death, and rebirth continues.
It's an incredibly powerful resume for a deity. But for thousands of years, according to the timeline in our sources, this profound reverence was largely geographically contained, right?
Yeah.
Like she was an Egyptian goddess for the Egyptian people, tied intimately to the flooding of the Nile.
Mostly, yes. There was some minor spread into the Levant through trade, but she was fundamentally rooted in Egyptian soil and Egyptian theology.
Until a very specific geopolitical shift happens.
Right.
And I want to run a theory by you here, because I was reading through the historical timelines in our sources, looking at the events around 305 BC.
Okay, let's hear it.
To my modern eyes, this transition doesn't read like an organic religious evolution. It honestly reads like a massive, highly calculated corporate rebrand.
A corporate rebrand.
Yeah, engineered by a political leader desperately trying to avoid a civil war.
I am very intrigued by that framing. Walk me through how you see the events of 305 BC as a corporate rebrand.
Okay, so let's set the stage. Alexander the Great sweeps out of Macedonia. He conquers the entire known world, including Egypt, and then he suddenly dies in 323 BC.
And leaves a massive power vacuum.
Right, he leaves no clear heir. His generals basically carve up his massive empire like a pie. One of his top generals, a Greek man named Ptolemy, takes control of Egypt.
Ptolemy I Soter, yes.
Exactly. A few years later, in 305 BC, he officially declares himself Pharaoh Ptolemy I Soter, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty. So now, politically, you have a massive problem. You have this tiny, elite Greek ruling class sitting on top of an enormous, ancient, natively Egyptian population.
And the cultural divide is staggering.
It's massive. They do not share a culture, they do not share a language, and crucially, they do not share gods.
They are completely alien to one another.
Right. So Ptolemy looks at this situation. He looks at Isis and he realizes, I have a deeply divided market. My company is going to tear itself apart. I need a unifying product.
That's a very modern way to phrase it, but yes.
He can't force the native Egyptians to worship Zeus, and he can't force his Greek soldiers to worship animal-headed Egyptian gods. So he intentionally Hellenizes Isis's worship. He repackages her to appeal to both demographics.
Well, we have to be careful not to view this strictly as a modern corporate move, because to Ptolemy, it wasn't just marketing. It was literal, existential, political survival.
Sure, the stakes were life and death.
But your analogy holds a lot of water. Ptolemy I Soter was a ruthless but brilliant strategist. He understood that in antiquity, religion was the fundamental glue of society.
It dictated everything.
It dictated law, it dictated the calendar, it dictated social hierarchy. If the Greeks and Egyptians couldn't worship together, they couldn't live together.
Right.
And you're right, the aesthetic divide was a massive hurdle. Greek gods looked like idealized humans.
Like marble statues of bodybuilders, basically.
Right. But Egyptian gods often had human bodies with the heads of ibises, jackals, or crocodiles. To the Greeks, this was bizarre, almost monstrous.
So Ptolemy needs a bridge, and his solution is essentially a divine merger.
A literal composite god. The Ptolemaic state realizes they can't just change Isis too drastically without offending the Egyptians, so they leave her core mythology intact but change her visual representation.
They give her a makeover.
They do. They start depicting her in Greek-style clothing with softer Hellenistic features, holding a cornucopia alongside her traditional Egyptian symbols. But the real stroke of genius was what they did with her husband, Osiris.
Right, because Osiris as a mummy isn't very Greek. They decide Osiris needs a complete overhaul.
Exactly. To pair with this newly Hellenized Isis, the Ptolemaic state essentially creates a brand new god out of thin air, a god named Serapis.
Serapis. When I read the breakdown of how they created him, I immediately thought, this is the ultimate Frankenstein deity. They just took pieces of different gods and stitched them together.
He really is a meticulously engineered theological blend. Let's look at his components. First, they took Osiris, who represents resurrection, the afterlife, and agricultural fertility.
The Egyptian foundation.
Yes. Then they combined him with Apis, the highly revered sacred Egyptian bull god. The combination of Osiris and Apis, Osiris-Apis, gives us the name Serapis.
Oh, wow. I didn't even catch that name mashup.
It's very literal. And this satisfies the native Egyptian population. They recognize the power and the history behind those names.
But a bill man isn't going to fly with the Greek elites in Alexandria.
Exactly. So they blend that Egyptian core with Zeus, the supreme Greek king of the gods, giving Serapis an imposing, bearded, patriarchal appearance.
Very traditional Greek.
And finally, they mix in Hades, the Greek god of the underworld, connecting him to the afterlife in a way the Greeks understood. When you look at a statue of Serapis, he looks exactly like a traditional Greek god, a bearded, majestic man sitting on a throne, but he carries the theological weight of ancient Egypt.
It's just wild to me that you can do that. You just issue a royal decree and say, hey, everyone, meet Serapis. He's got the best features of 4 different gods. He looks Greek but acts Egyptian. And oh, by the way, he's the official husband of Isis now. And people just accepted it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it worked because it offered something to everyone. The Egyptians could look at Serapis and see Osiris. The Greeks could look at him and see Zeus, or Hades.
And Isis was the familiar anchor for the Egyptians while looking approachable for the Greeks.
She was the glue that held the whole concept together. This strategic religious fusion was the perfect packaging. It created a highly adaptable, culturally bilingual theology.
It's brilliant.
Isis was no longer just an Egyptian goddess tied exclusively to the flooding of the Nile, By pairing her with Serapis, giving her a visual makeover, and translating her myths into Greek concepts, she became completely exportable.
Which perfectly sets the stage for her to leave the borders of Egypt and basically conquer the Mediterranean, because the viral spread of this cult is just staggering. And looking at the timelines, she doesn't do it the way Roman gods spread, does she?
Yeah, not at all.
Like Jupiter and Mars spread because the Roman legions march in with swords and build temples. Isis doesn't use armies. She spreads through everyday people moving along the trade routes.
Yes, the geography of her expansion is incredibly revealing. It tracks almost perfectly with maritime trade. Remember, Alexandria in Egypt became the beating heart of Mediterranean commerce under the Ptolemies.
It was the center of the world for trade.
Grain from Egypt fed the ancient world, so ships are constantly leaving Egypt, full of sailors, merchants, and unfortunately enslaved people, and they're carrying their localized, repackaged version of Isis with them.
Let's talk about the sailors specifically. The sources mention her taking on a brand new title during this expansion, Isis Pelagia, the protector of seafarers, which, if you think about the daily life of an ancient sailor, makes total sense.
Put yourself in the sandals of a 1st century BC dock worker or sailor. Your life is entirely dependent on the whims of the Mediterranean Sea, which is notoriously violent and unpredictable.
Especially in winter.
You are risking your life on a wooden boat, held together by wooden pegs and rope. You want a deity who actually cares whether you live and die.
And if you're choosing a god to pray to in a hurricane, do you want Poseidon, who is famously temperamental, angry, and causes storms when he's annoyed?
This is not exactly a comforting figure.
Right. Or do you want Isis, the mother goddess who literally knows the source code of reality, who conquered death and who controls the elements?
It's an easy choice for a terrified sailor, and we see the archaeological proof of this adoption very early on. By around 100 BC, we see a major Iseum, a temple of Isis constructed on the island of Delos in Greece.
Delos is a fascinating location for this to happen. It wasn't just a random island in the Aegean.
Not at all. Delos was essentially the Wall Street and the central shipping hub of the ancient Aegean. It was a massive free trade port.
Because it was tax-free, right?
Exactly. Because it was tax-free for a time, it was a total melting pot. Merchants from Syria, sailors from Egypt, bankers from Italy, and enslaved people from all over the Mediterranean mixed daily. When a temple to Isis is built on Delos, it means she has officially entered the mainstream of international commerce.
And from Delos, the sailors and the merchants carry her worship right up the Italian peninsula. We see early sacred sites popping up in Campania, Italy. They arrive via major trade ports like Puteoli, which is modern-day Pozzuoli, right near Naples. She is practically knocking on the door of Rome itself.
And this is where the historical narrative becomes incredibly dramatic. Because while the sailors and the common people are embracing her, the conservative political establishment in Rome, the Senate, is absolutely terrified of her.
I want to spend some time on this because it is such a bizarre clash of values.
Yeah.
The sources note that the Roman Senate didn't just frown on the cult of Isis, they actively tried to violently suppress it.
They passed laws against it.
They ordered her altars destroyed multiple times during the 1st century BC. I was reading one account where the Senate ordered the altars torn down, but the regular workmen in Rome refused to do it because they were too scared of the goddess.
That's a very famous incident, yes.
The consuls of Rome, the highest elected officials, had to physically take off their formal togas, pick up axes, and strike the first blows against the stone themselves just to get the demolition started.
Oh.
That is a level of political desperation you rarely see.
It demonstrates profound panic within the ruling class. To the Roman establishment, the cult of Isis wasn't just a foreign religion. It was a dangerous infection that was rotting the moral fiber of the Republic.
Okay, I have a theory about this, and I want you to tell me if I'm off base here. I get the xenophobia aspect. Romans were naturally suspicious of anything Eastern, anything Egyptian. But the sources explicitly state that the Senate feared the cult because of its emotional nature.
Right.
Now, on the surface, being afraid of emotion seems ridiculous. Was the Senate actually afraid of people crying at an altar? Or were they really afraid of the underground networking? Were they afraid that slaves and freedmen and commoners were gathering in secret and getting too organized?
You're hitting on a crucial layer of it, the socio-political fear of unregulated assembly. But you cannot discount the genuine theological terror they felt regarding that emotional nature.
Really, the emotion itself was terrifying.
To understand their fear, we have to look fundamentally at how official Roman civic religion operated. We briefly touched on this earlier, but it requires a deeper look. Roman religion was built entirely on the concept of Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods.
Right. keep the gods happy, keep Rome safe.
But happy is almost the wrong word. It was a contractual, highly bureaucratic relationship. You perform this exact specific animal sacrifice at this specific time of day with these exact specific Latin words so that the state wins its next military campaign and the grain ships arrive on time.
It's very transactional.
It was essentially legalistic. If a priest misspoke a single word during a 2-hour prayer, they had to start the entire ceremony over from the beginning because the legal contract with Jupiter was voided.
Wow. Just for one word.
Yes, it had absolutely nothing to do with personal morality, and crucially, it had nothing to do with how you felt inside.
It was basically cosmic tax law. You fill out the forms correctly, you pay your dues, and the celestial IRS leaves Rome alone.
Precisely. Now, inject the cult of Isis into that environment, a religion that is highly, overwhelmingly emotional. The worshippers are openly weeping in the streets for the death of Osiris. They are crying out in ecstatic joy at his resurrection.
They're feeling it deeply.
They are chanting, singing, playing loud metallic instruments, working themselves into a frenzy. To a stoic, conservative Roman senator raised on the icy rigidity of Pax Deorum, this uncontrolled emotionalism looked like literal madness.
It looked un-Roman.
It looked like a total loss of self-control, which was considered the ultimate Roman sin. A citizen who cannot control their emotions cannot be trusted to control a legion, or to vote rationally, or to put the state above their own desires.
I see.
They viewed this emotional religion as a rot that would weaken the Republic from the inside out.
And it probably didn't help that during this exact same period in the 1st century BC, Rome is literally tearing itself apart in a series of massive, bloody civil wars.
The timing is very important.
The Republic is collapsing. And the final defining conflict is the clash between Octavian, who becomes the first Emperor Augustus, and the allied forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra.
That is the geopolitical gasoline poured on the fire. You have to remember how Mark Antony and Cleopatra branded themselves. They intentionally styled themselves in their propaganda as the living, breathing embodiments of Osiris and Isis.
Right. They were leaning hard into the myth.
They used the religion to legitimize their rule over the Eastern Mediterranean.
So if you are a Roman senator sitting in Italy, watching Octavian fight for the survival of traditional Roman values, the cult of Isis isn't just weird and emotional anymore. It is actively treasonous.
Exactly.
It represents the literal enemy general who's trying to conquer you.
Worshipping Isis in Rome during the war with Cleopatra was like flying an enemy flag in your front yard. It was viewed as a direct existential threat to Roman stability, hence the sledgehammers, hence the desperation to wipe it out.
But here's the incredible thing. They couldn't stop it. The Senate smashes the altars. They officially ban the cult. They try to drive it out of the city. But the people just keep rebuilding the shrines in secret.
The grassroots momentum is entirely unstoppable.
And this leads to a massive, incredible irony in our historical timeline. The Republic finally falls. Octavian becomes Augustus. The empire is established. And within a few generations, the Roman emperors completely flip the script on Isis.
They do. It's a breathtaking 180-degree turn in imperial policy.
They don't just tolerate her, they actively embrace her. The Emperor Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 AD, just decades after she was considered a treasonous threat, he builds the Grand Iseum Campus right in the heart of the Campus Martius in Rome.
It was a massive, sprawling, highly funded temple complex.
And then later, Emperor Caracalla, around 211 AD, goes even further. The sources say he builds an enormous temple to Isis inside the pomerium.
The pomerium is the key detail there. We need to explain what that boundary represented to the Roman psyche.
Because it wasn't just a physical wall, right?
No. The pomerium was the sacred, strictly protected, traditional religious boundary of the city of Rome. It was a spiritual quarantine zone. For centuries, foreign cults and foreign gods were legally forbidden from crossing that line. They had to stay on the outside.
Keep the foreign influence out of the sacred heart of Rome.
Exactly. By actively building a temple to Isis inside the pomerium, Emperor Caracalla was making a profound theological and political statement. He was essentially declaring, she is no longer a foreign Egyptian goddess. She is us. She is a chief patron of the Roman state.
It's an incredible political calculation. Because let's be honest, the emperors didn't just wake up one day and decide they had a deep aesthetic appreciation for Egyptian architecture.
No, it was entirely pragmatic.
They embraced her because she was undeniably, overwhelmingly popular among the masses. It was a classic, if you can't beat them, join them, and then tax them. situation.
It was practical governance. The emperors realized that the cult provided a social cohesion that the state religion was failing to provide.
Which brings us to the core mystery of this entire deep dive.
Yeah.
Why? Why did a dock worker in Greece, a freedman in Rome, and a wealthy patrician woman all love her so much that they defied the Senate, risked political persecution, and completely devoted their lives to her?
What was she offering that Jupiter wasn't? What's fascinating here is the stark contrast in the user experience, to borrow a modern term, between state religion and what Isis offered. The cult of Isis wasn't just another flavor of civic duty. It was what historians call a mystery religion.
Okay, let's unpack that term mystery religion, because when we hear that today, it sounds like a secret society, like the Freemasons or maybe a true crime podcast. But in antiquity, it meant something very specific, didn't it?
It did. A mystery religion in the ancient Greco-Roman world was a voluntary religious group that required a specific, deeply secretive initiation ritual to join.
So you had to opt in.
Yes, you weren't born into it just by being a Roman citizen. You had to choose it. But in return for undergoing that initiation, the cult offered things the state religion simply could not provide. Foremost among them was the promise of direct personal salvation.
Which didn't exist in traditional Roman religion.
Not at all. It offered an intimate, emotional, one-on-one communion with the loving mother goddess who actually cared about you as an individual, regardless of your status.
Unlike Jupiter, who only cares if the Roman legions win the next battle in Gaul, Jupiter doesn't care if you have a toothache. Isis does.
Exactly. And most importantly, perhaps the greatest selling point of all, Isis offered a guaranteed, peaceful afterlife.
This is huge, because the traditional Greco-Roman afterlife is notoriously depressing. If you read Homer or Virgil, the underworld, Hades, is incredibly bleak.
It's just a dark subterranean cavern.
Yeah, where you just sort of float around as a miserable, shadowy, amnesiac echo of yourself for eternity. The Greek hero Achilles famously says in the Odyssey that he would rather be a living slave to a poor farmer than be the king of all the dead.
That was the prevailing cultural anxiety. Death was a terrifying void, but Isis brings the ancient Egyptian theology of the afterlife to the Mediterranean masses. She promises her followers that if they are initiated, if they learn her secrets and remain faithful, they will not become mindless shadows.
They actually get a reward.
They will live on in the plains of Reed. This was conceptualized as a beautiful, sunlit, peaceful existence, a perfect mirroring of the best parts of physical life. You would be reunited with your loved ones.
For a common person in antiquity, whose life was often brutal, exhausted by disease, and filled with hard manual labor, that promise of a beautiful eternal rest was utterly revolutionary.
It changes the entire calculus of human existence.
It really does. But beyond the afterlife, what I found to be the absolute most radical part of this cult, the true secret to its viral spread on a daily societal level, was its complete erasure of social boundaries inside the temple walls.
Yes. This is where the cult becomes genuinely subversive to the Roman order. In traditional Roman society, your social class dictated absolutely everything.
Like down to the clothes you wore.
Exactly. It dictated where you sat in the gladiatorial arena, it dictated the colors and fabrics you were legally allowed to wear, and it dictated exactly what role you could play in public religious ceremonies. It was a rigidly stratified caste system.
Put yourself back in the sandals of that first-century dockworker. You spend every day of your life being treated as completely expendable. You have no legal recourse. You are invisible to the elite.
You're just a tool.
Right. But you step inside the Iseum, you cross the threshold into the Temple of Isis, and all of that rigid Roman hierarchy just vanishes. You could have a wealthy, aristocratic patrician senator, a freedman who just bought his liberty last week, and a currently enslaved person, all standing shoulder to shoulder singing the exact same hymns as absolute spiritual equals.
It is hard to overstate how shocking and how deeply comforting that was for the ancient world. The cult created a liminal space where the intrinsic divine value of a human soul was recognized above their legal civic status.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
If you were an initiate, you were a sibling in the eyes of Isis, whether you owned a villa or swept the floors of one.
And if you want to know what this erasure of social boundaries looked like in practice, we actually have physical proof. We don't have to guess because we have Pompeii.
The archaeological gold mine.
Exactly. In our sources, the timeline points out that when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, burying the city in ash, it perfectly preserved a highly active, beautifully decorated Temple of Isis right there in Pompeii.
And what's fascinating is the history of that specific building prior to the eruption.
Right, because Pompeii had suffered a massive earthquake in 62 AD, about 17 years before the volcano. Much of the city was destroyed. The Temple of Isis was one of the very first public buildings the citizens chose to completely rebuild from the ground up.
Which tells you everything you need to know about her popularity and importance to the local community. They prioritized her temple over traditional civic buildings.
Yes, and when archaeologists excavated it, they found plaques dedicating the rebuilding. The massive financial contribution to rebuild the temple was made in the name of a 6-year-old boy.
Which seems very strange at first glance.
Right, a 6-year-old funding a temple. Why? Because his father was a freedman, a former slave. Under Roman law, a former slave could not hold political office no matter how wealthy he became, but his freeborn son could.
Ah, so it was a political maneuver.
Exactly. This freedman uses the cult of Isis to catapult his son into the social elite of Pompeii. The temple was an engine for social mobility.
And it wasn't just class boundaries being erased, it was gender boundaries. The cult offered a massive empowerment of women that was highly unusual for the period.
Because Isis herself was a goddess of autonomous power.
Right.
We talked about how she didn't wait for a hero, she was the hero. She didn't derive her power from being a male god's wife.
She wielded Heka herself to save her husband.
Right. This mythic independence translated directly to her mortal followers.
It had to. In standard Roman society, a woman was perpetually legally subject to the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, either her father or her husband.
She had very little independence.
She could not easily own property, she could not vote, she had very little independent agency. But inside the cult of Isis, that patriarchal structure was significantly flattened.
The sources show women holding high-ranking priesthoods. They weren't just background worshippers.
No, they were leading the ceremonies.
They were running independent administrative roles. They were making complex financial and real estate decisions for the temple. It offered women a completely different, autonomous life path, a career trajectory that simply did not exist anywhere else in the standard Roman world.
This raised their social capital immensely. It allowed women to build their own networks of influence, protected by the sanctity of the goddess.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. We've talked about how she absorbed different classes and genders, but the way the cult handled other religions is a masterclass in assimilation.
It really is.
It wasn't about conquering other gods and wiping them out. It was about absorbing them. I mentioned a corporate rebrand earlier, but looking at how she spread globally, it was more like the ultimate open source religion.
Open source is a brilliant analogy. Let's explore that. In antiquity, as she spread, she was given a specific title by her worshippers, Myrionymos, which translates from Greek as the goddess of 10,000 names.
The goddess of 10,000 names. That is incredible marketing.
It is the ultimate expression of syncretism. As the cult spread geographically into new territories, the priests of Isis didn't act like traditional missionaries. They didn't arrive in a new town and tell the local population, your goddess is fake. Tear down her statue and worship ours.
Because that causes riots. That gets you killed.
Exactly. It's bad for business. Instead, they took a much more philosophical approach. They would say, your local goddess of the harvest or the sea or the moon is wonderful, but she is actually just one localized manifestation, one name of the true universal mother, Isis.
Oh, wow.
You've been worshiping Isis this whole time. You just didn't know her true name.
If Isis is an open source software platform, then all these local gods are just local skins or mods that different cultures applied to the same core code.
Exactly. The underlying operating system was always Isis.
So when the cult gets to Greece, they look at Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and nature, and they say, oh, Artemis, that's just Isis.
And the locals go, okay, that makes sense.
When they get to Rome and see Venus, the goddess of love, they say, Venus is Isis. In Phoenicia, the goddess Astarte, also Isis. She just absorbs their attributes and their followers.
This created a massive, widespread cultural bridge. It allowed people from completely different, sometimes hostile cultures and geographies to find a common, unifying spiritual language.
That's fascinating.
A merchant from Alexandria in Egypt could travel to a port in Gaul or Spain, walk into a local temple, and even if the statue of the goddess looked slightly different, he knew how to run the software. He knew the rituals, he knew the hymns, he was instantly part of a community.
And that geographical footprint is absolutely staggering. When you look at the archaeological evidence laid out in our sources, they are unearthing Isiac temples and artifacts far, far beyond the sunny, warm Mediterranean.
Far into the north.
Yeah. They found artifacts dedicated to Isis in modern-day London, what the Romans called Londinium. They found them deep into Central Europe, in Cologne, Germany. They found temple remains all along the freezing, hostile borders of the Danube frontier.
It truly was a globalized religion. Centuries before the concept of a borderless world or globalized trade networks truly existed in the modern sense.
There is this one vivid, almost cinematic image from the historical sources that just stuck with me, speaking of the frontiers. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman soldiers stationed at the very, very edges of the empire. Places like Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain carrying tiny amulets of Isis into battle.
It's a striking contrast, isn't it?
Just imagine that. A Roman legionary standing in the freezing, sleeting rain in the mud of northern Britain, facing an attack. And he isn't wearing an amulet of Mars, the god of war. He is wearing a tiny carving of an Egyptian mother goddess as his protective shield.
It demonstrates the deep psychological comfort she provided. A soldier far from home facing imminent violent death didn't turn to the cold, contractual state gods of Rome who only cared about the political state.
He didn't want Jupiter's bureaucracy.
He turned to the loving, protective mother who actually had the power to conquer death and who promised him a beautiful afterlife if he fell in battle.
But to maintain that kind of intense, deeply personal loyalty from the frozen borders of Scotland all the way back to the blazing sands of Egypt, you need incredibly strong communal bonds. You can't just rely on amulets.
No, amulets aren't enough to build a 3,000-year religion.
You need unforgettable, shared physical experiences that lock people into the community and make them feel a part of something larger than themselves. Which brings us to the actual sights, the sounds, and the fiercely guarded secrets of the cult's rituals.
This is where we have to divide the religion into two distinct spheres. We must separate the public, outward-facing face of the religion from the inner, hidden mysteries.
Right, because there were public festivals that absolutely anyone could attend. You didn't have to be initiated. There were huge, joyous civic parties that dominated city life. The sources mention two major ones that anchored the calendar.
Yes, the spring and autumn festivals.
First, there was the Navigium Isidis on March 5th. This was a massive, incredibly colorful procession that marched from the temple through the city streets all the way down to the harbor.
Its primary purpose was to bless the opening of the sailing season. During the winter, the Mediterranean was too dangerous for trade ships. The Navigium Isidis marked the day it was safe to sail again.
They would literally launch a beautifully decorated, uncrewed wooden ship into the water, loaded with floral offerings to secure the goddess's protection for the fleet.
Which was a very crucial, pragmatic festival for a society like Rome that relied entirely on massive maritime grain shipments from Egypt for its daily food supply. If the ships didn't sail, Rome starved.
And then on the other end of the calendar, in late October, you had the Asia. This was completely different in tone. It was a multi-day public reenactment of the myth we talked about at the beginning.
A passion play, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah. The crowd would mourn the death of Osiris, reenact Isis's desperate search, and climax with a joyful, ecstatic celebration of his resurrection. And the sensory details of these public rites, as described by ancient historians, are just amazing. If you were standing in the crowd on a Roman street, the primary thing you would hear is the constant rhythmic shaking of the sistrum.
The sistrum is a sacred bronze rattle. It has a handle and a U-shaped metal frame with loose crossbars. When you shake it, it produces a very distinct, piercing, metallic, clattering sound.
Like a loud tambourine.
Yes. In ancient Egyptian theology, that specific sound frequency was believed to agitate and drive away chaotic or evil spirits. It physically purified the space for the goddess to enter.
So you have hundreds of people shaking these bronze rattles, creating this deafening metallic hum. You have chanting, singing, thick clouds of incense, and then you have the priests walking through the crowd carrying the situla.
The situla was very important.
It was this beautiful, often breast-shaped metallic vessel that held holy water, but not just any water from a local well.
No, this was water drawn directly from the Nile River in Egypt, painstakingly transported in sealed amphorae all over the empire.
It's incredible logistical dedication.
It was necessary theology. That water represented the life-giving essence of Egypt itself. It was considered the physical fluid of the god Osiris. By carrying it through the streets of Rome or Athens or London, the priests were bringing the literal, physical presence of the divine directly to the people.
But all that, the processions, the rattles, the holy water, that was just the public stuff. The real power of the cult, the thing that created the unbreakable bonds of loyalty, was what happened behind closed doors.
The inner mysteries.
The secret initiation. And for a very long time, historians and archaeologists had almost no idea what actually went on in there, because the initiates were sworn to absolute silence under threat of horrific divine punishment.
We were largely in the dark, historically speaking, until we turned to one of the most remarkable, bizarre, and illuminating documents from the ancient world.
The novel.
Yes, Book 11 of a novel called The Metamorphoses, which is more commonly known today as The Golden Ass.
I love this book so much. It is such a wild ride. It is written by a man named Apuleius, a North African Roman writer, philosopher, and rhetorician living in the late 2nd century A.D.
He was a fascinating figure himself.
And this fictional novel contains our only detailed first-hand narrative of the inner secrets of an Isiac initiation. I really want to spend some time here because the premise of the book is completely unhinged.
It is a brilliant piece of literature. It is ancient body satire, violently mixed with profound, genuine religious devotion.
For our listeners who haven't read it, let me set the scene. The protagonist of the novel is this young, aristocratic guy named Lucius. He's traveling in Greece. He is overly curious, he's arrogant, and he decides he wants to mess around with dark magic that he doesn't understand.
A classic mistake in ancient literature.
Long story short, a spell goes horribly wrong, and he accidentally turns himself into a donkey.
Yeah.
And he retains his human mind, but he is trapped inside a donkey's body. He spends the entire novel getting stolen by bandits, beaten, overworked at a mill, and suffering horribly because of his own hubris.
We shouldn't gloss over the thematic weight of his transformation. His turning into a donkey isn't just a physical gag.
Oh, there's symbolic meaning to it.
Deeply symbolic. In the ancient philosophical worldview, the donkey was considered the lowest, most stubborn, most base animal. Lucius's transformation into a beast of burden represents the ultimate degradation of the human soul when it becomes entirely enslaved to base desires, physical lusts, and spiritual ignorance.
Oh, wow. I didn't catch that depth.
He is literally trapped in the animalistic side of his nature.
It's a psychological horror story. But then, in the final book, Book 11, he hits absolute rock bottom. He is exhausted, suicidal, and sleeping on a beach. He wakes up in the middle of the night, looks up at the full moon, and just starts praying out of sheer desperation.
He finally surrenders his ego.
And Isis answers. She appears to him in a majestic vision. She takes pity on him. She tells him exactly how to find a priest carrying a specific crown of roses during her upcoming public festival. If he eats the roses, the magic will break and he will turn back into a human.
And spoiler alert, it works.
It works. He eats the roses, his animal skin falls away, and he is saved. And in an outpouring of profound gratitude, he decides he must devote his entire life to her.
Through the character of Lucius, he outlines, step by step, the rigorous, ascetic, physical preparation required before a candidate could even approach the inner sanctum.
Right, because you don't just walk up to the high priest and say, hey, Isis saved me, I'm ready to learn the secrets. It's a massive ordeal.
A physical and spiritual trial.
First, the priests have to consult the divine signs to even see if he's worthy. And when he is approved, they put him through a physically agonizing process.
The candidate had to undergo a strictly enforced, highly demanding 10-day fast. This meant absolutely no meat, no wine, and likely severe caloric restriction, if not total fasting from solid food for stretches.
That is brutal.
Alongside this dietary shock, the initiate was subjected to extreme physical isolation within the temple precinct. They were locked in a small cell, completely cut off from the outside world, their family, and the sunlight.
Sensory deprivation.
Yes. Finally, at the end of the 10 days, there was a ritual bath, a physical washing away of the dirt of the old life.
10 days of fasting and total isolation. I mean, let's look at this from a purely modern physiological and psychological standpoint. Your brain chemistry is fundamentally changing.
Oh, you are highly vulnerable.
You are exhausted, your blood sugar is completely depleted, you are hungry, and you are suffering from severe sensory deprivation. You are being scientifically primed for a profoundly altered state of consciousness.
Exactly. None of this was accidental. Every single step of the preparation was meticulously designed to break down the ego. It was designed to move the initiate away from mundane, logical, physical reality into a highly receptive, psychologically vulnerable, and highly suggestible state.
And then, the night of the initiation finally arrives. They dress Lucius in a simple linen robe. They take him deep into the temple, down into the Adyton, the windowless, subterranean, most sacred inner sanctum. The doors lock behind him.
He's all alone.
And Apuleius, writing as Lucius, gives us this highly encoded, intensely poetic description of what happens next. Because he can't give away the actual verbal passwords or physical actions without breaking his holy vows, he describes the experience. I want to read the exact quote from the sources because it is chillingly beautiful, and it's the closest we will ever get to being in that room.
Please do. It's a foundational text for understanding mystery cults.
He writes, I approached the boundary of death, and treading on the threshold of Proserpine, I returned having been carried through all the elements. At midnight I saw the sun flashing with radiant light. I came face to face with the gods below and the gods above, and paid reverence to them from close at hand.
It is a stunning passage. Let's unpack the references. Proserpine, of course, is the Roman queen of the underworld, the equivalent to Persephone.
So he's saying he went to hell and back.
He is explicitly, unequivocally stating that he physically traveled to the realm of the dead and came back alive.
Okay, so here is where I have to play the skeptic. I want to push back on the ancient mindset here and look at this mechanically. How much of this experience do you think was a genuine, supernatural, mystical hallucination brought on by 10 days of starving in a dark room, and how much of this was essentially highly funded, highly choreographed, ancient, immersive theater?
It was almost certainly a masterpiece of both psychological engineering and theatrical illusion. When modern scholars, historians, and even psychologists unpack the mechanics of this ritual based on temple architecture, they see a perfectly choreographed near-death experience and resurrection.
So how do they actually do it? Let's take the most famous line. At midnight, I saw the sun flashing with radiant light. How do you make someone see the sun inside a windowless basement at midnight?
Think about the psychological and physiological breakdown we just discussed. The priests have a subject who is physically exhausted, trembling, and sensory deprived from the 10-day fast. They lead him into the pitch-black, windowless chamber of the Adyton. He has been in the dark for a long time. His pupils are completely, fully dilated, straining to see anything in the blackness.
And then boom.
Precisely. Sudden, violent shifts in lighting. We know from archaeological finds that temples often had complex pulley systems and hidden alcoves. At a specific cue, a massive array of hidden torches or reflective oil lamps are suddenly ignited or unveiled, creating an immediate blinding flash of light inside the dark room.
And to dilated eyes, that would be blinding.
To eyes adjusted to total, absolute darkness, that sudden blaze literally looks like the sun has suddenly appeared at midnight. It overloads the optic nerve.
Okay, that explains the light. But then he says he came face to face with the gods. He didn't just see a light, he saw deities.
Theatrical props and sensory manipulation. Through the blinding light and the incredibly thick, heavy, smoky haze of temple incense, which, it should be noted, might have contained mild psychoactive properties like blue lotus to further alter perception, the priests emerged from the shadows.
Wow, so he might have been mildly tripping too.
Very likely. And they aren't just wearing robes. They are wearing massive, terrifyingly elaborate, larger-than-life masks of underworld deities. You would see Anubis, the jackal god of embalming. You would see Osiris, wrapped as a mummy.
Oh my God. I'm trying to picture this. If I had been fasting for 10 days, locked in a silent room, and then suddenly a blinding light flashes, drums start pounding, and a giant human-sized jackal walks out of the smoke right up to my face, I would 100% believe I had crossed the boundary of death. I would believe anything they told me.
It was designed to induce absolute terror, followed immediately by the profound euphoria of salvation when Isis saves you from the underworld. But this raises an important question. Why go through all this trouble?
Yeah, why?
Why engineer such a terrifying, visceral, and expensive experience? It wasn't just for entertainment. It comes down to the 3 core pillars of the cult's ritual ideology.
Right, let's break those pillars down because they explain why the cult was so sticky. The first one the sources mention is the concept of voluntary death.
Yes. The ritual was explicitly framed as a voluntary, highly controlled encounter with death. The entire point was to completely, irrevocably shatter the candidate's previous identity.
To break them down, to build them back up.
You walk into that dark room as Lucius the arrogant Roman citizen or Lucius the dock worker, and that identity symbolically dies. It is destroyed by the terror of the underworld. You are then resurrected, bathed in light, as a brand new person, a loyal, eternal servant of Isis. It fundamentally stripped you of your old civic allegiances.
Which perfectly explains why the Roman Senate hated it so much. We were talking earlier about the Senate smashing altars. If the core of your ritual is renouncing your primary identity to be reborn into a new loyalty, you are basically renouncing your primary loyalty to the state.
Precisely. To the Senate, a citizen's first loyalty is to Rome. To an initiate, their first loyalty is to Isis.
The second pillar is the arcanum, the absolute secrecy.
Secrecy is a tremendously powerful psychological tool for community building. When you share a profound, terrifying, and ultimately euphoric experience with a small group of people, and you are all bound by a sacred vow of silence under threat of divine curse, it forges immense, unbreakable communal bonds.
It's essentially trauma bonding mixed with spiritual ecstasy. The initiates, the Mystae, form this highly exclusive in-group.
They share a massive secret.
Imagine you walk down a crowded, noisy street in Rome. You make eye contact with another initiate. You might not even speak the same language, but you both know exactly what you saw in that dark room. You know you've both died and come back. But you can never, ever speak of it to the uninitiated.
That shared secret makes the community incredibly tight-knit and resilient against outside persecution.
And then there's the third pillar, which is perhaps the most pragmatic, the one that often surprises modern audiences, the financial commitment.
Yes, the cost.
This part blew my mind when I was reading the breakdown in the sources, because getting initiated was not a free community service. It was not a charity event for the poor.
Far from it. While the public festivals were free to attend, the inner mystery initiation was shockingly expensive. Initiates had to personally fund their entire journey, and the temple extracted a heavy toll.
Let's talk about the price tag, because it's exorbitant. You aren't just showing up. You had to pay for your own highly specific, imported, pure Egyptian linen robes. You had to pay the priests a massive stipend for the 10 days of housing, feeding, and spiritual preparation.
The temple wasn't running a free hotel.
You had to pay for the expensive sacrifices. And then, the kicker, after the initiation was complete, you were expected to throw massive, lavish banquets for the rest of the temple community to celebrate your birthday into the cult.
It required substantial, sometimes crippling sums of wealth. Apuleius notes in the novel that Lucius actually had to sell the clothes off his back to afford the final initiation rites. It drained him completely.
So what does this all mean? When we look at the massive historical arc of this cult we started in the pyramid texts of 2500 BC, we watched her get rebranded by Ptolemy, spread by sailors to Delos, terrifying the Roman Senate, getting embraced by emperors, surviving the ashes of Pompeii. This immense popularity lasts for centuries.
It dominates the spiritual landscape of the Mediterranean all the way until 537 AD.
Right. That is when Emperor Justinian finally, officially, legally closes the very last operational temple of Isis on the island of Philae in Egypt, as the changing religious landscape of the late Roman Empire consolidates power, marking the formal institutional end of the cult in antiquity.
It is an absolutely incredible 3,000-year run.
But why should we care today?
Right.
Why does a defunct Egyptian goddess matter to someone listening to this deep dive right now?
It matters deeply because it reveals something fundamental and unchanging about human nature. The cult of Isis proves that the human desire for a deeply personal, emotionally resonant spiritual community is not a modern invention.
We've always wanted that.
The craving for a space that ignores your social class, ignores your gender, and treats you as a valuable, equal human soul who deserves salvation is a timeless human craving. When the rigid, cold institutions of the state, like the Roman civic religion, fail to provide emotional comfort and fail to recognize individual humanity, people will seek out or invent communities that do.
It's the search for meaning, agency, and belonging in a cold, bureaucratic world. We're still doing exactly that today, just with different names and different organizations.
Absolutely. The human hardwiring hasn't changed since the 1st century BC.
But I want to leave you, our listener, with a final, slightly more cynical, provocative thought to mull over. Something that isn't explicitly spelled out in the historical text we reviewed, but is staring us right in the face when you connect the psychology of those initiation rituals with the economics.
The intersection of the extreme secrecy and the immense financial cost.
Exactly. We just spent a lot of time talking about how the initiation required absolute, terror-inducing secrecy and immense, out-of-pocket financial ruin. You had to buy the imported robes, pay the exorbitant priestly fees, host the massive banquets. Apuleius tells us Lucius sold his own clothes to pay for it.
It was a tremendous, life-altering investment of personal resources.
So here is the psychological puzzle to ponder on your own. Did the high priests of the cult of Isis, thousands of years ago, essentially perfect the psychology of what we now call the sunk cost fallacy?
It is a brilliant and highly plausible question.
Think about it. By making the initiation incredibly painfully expensive, and by wrapping it in layers of terrifying, life-altering secrecy and trauma bonding, they absolutely guaranteed that the high-level initiates would never, ever abandon the temple hierarchy.
They couldn't afford to walk away.
Right. Because if you walk away from the cult 10 years later, you have to admit to yourself that you spent a fortune, you went bankrupt. And you endured psychological terror in the dark. For absolutely nothing. They had simply invested far too much of their wealth and completely restructured their entire identity around this secret to ever let it go. It's not just spiritual devotion. It is a psychological lock-in of the highest order.
A fascinating and likely very intentional mechanism of ancient institutional survival. When you make the exit cost higher than the entrance cost, your community never shrinks.
Something to think about the next time you are asked to invest heavily financially or emotionally in an exclusive, secretive community. Keep diving deep, and we'll see you next time.